Thank you, Mr. Stubbe. Ms. Tenney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your expertise. We greatly appreciate it. Just want to first say one of the reasons we're here today is Ways and Means has sole House jurisdiction over the federal debt, and to fulfill this committee's duty to ensure that existing federal debt is being managed at the lowest cost to the American taxpayer. Part of this means ensuring that the American people have more transparency surrounding the Treasury's debt management practices. So with that being said, Mr. Dreesen, it is my understanding that the Treasury has discretion over the debt management process. Is this correct? And if so, where does this discretion derive from?
Yeah, Treasury does have relatively broad discretion within to manage federal debt. So there's a lot of places in statute where that's provided. One of the big places is 31 USC 3100s. And so, Congress can certainly make changes to the what sort of powers they delegate to Treasury, but there is a lot of power with the Treasury Secretary and more generally.
So rulemaking also under the Code of Federal Regulations, I see, has happened over the years as well.
Yes, yes.
So do you know, since that time of that statute, like when is the most recent modification that to the statute was made that is impacting the ability of the Treasury, either for the better or worse, to manage our debt?
Sure. So I think the most observers would say kind of the last significant changes made to those portions of the code were several decades ago. I think there were large changes in the 1970s and 1980s, largely to make the process a little bit more predictable and transparent. There have been some small changes since then, 2010 and others, but I think significant, you're talking several decades.
Still significant ability to manage the debt.
Right.
Exactly. Thank you so much. As many know, the United States has benefited from historically favorable credit ratings, allowing the federal government to issue Treasuries on relatively favorable terms. However, as funding deficits and projected debt to GDP ratios have grown over time, the country's credit rating has not. For example, on August 1st, 2023, Fitch Ratings downgraded the country's long-term foreign currency issuer default rating from AAA to AA+, which was the first time a ratings firm lowered its assessment of the U.S. government's ability to pay its debt on time since 2011. Mr. Falconer, can you please describe the relationship between Treasury's debt issuance strategy and credit ratings?
Sure. So all bond issuances have to be rated in order for many mutual funds and different fund families to hold them. And so the rating agencies differently model out governments, corporates, utilities, and financials, and then they set a rating on the likelihood of being repaid. Treasury meets with the three major rating agencies each year to discuss the fiscal outlook and to give, and from that information they obtain, the rating agencies then provide a rating that is as been said by my panelists, the foundational interest rates that are provided in global financial markets.
Well, let's bring this home. How does this affect American families? The bottom line there.
So the higher the borrowing costs for the U.S. government, the higher the borrowing costs for nearly every other form of credit for the American people. So it's not just that they are going to pay higher taxes in the future to support higher interest costs, but any borrowing they're doing in their own household is going to be higher if U.S. Treasury rates are higher because their bond rating is lower.
Thank you. So quickly, since I'll stick with you, Mr. Falconer. You may recall a slide that Mr. Kogan shared earlier today during his testimony, which argued that revenue and spending are both lower than earlier projections, suggesting that low revenues are responsible for the persistent primary deficits. So what are your thoughts on this, and do you agree with Mr. Kogan's proposal?
Well, again, the revenue forecasts relied upon current law extending in ways that it's not clear Congress actually would have. So we suffered, for instance, from what's known as bracket creep, which is that as people made more money, a higher portion of their income was then thrown into a higher tax bracket. In order to have those CBO projections continue, you would have had to assume that Congress would not have fixed that. Likewise, as we know, the alternative minimum tax, for instance, was implemented to capture a couple of millionaires that weren't paying very much in federal income taxes. And yet by into the 2000s, you had a few million taxpayers being hit by the AMT, and so Congress came in and modified it because it extended beyond what its original objective was. One has to presume that Congress would not have made those fixes that American households would be paying about 25% higher taxes today.
Well, let me ask you this. Aren't a lot of these things static numbers? Isn't there a lot of growth that happened because of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act?
that is the other piece, is that you have to presume that we would have continued to have the growth output we had. We saw higher growth rates following the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. There's some recent academic work that shows that. It's hard to argue that we would have had the same economic output and the same spending levels had tax rates been
So
substantially.
historically, where are we with revenues today?
Revenues is a percent of GDP, which is, I think, the best way to look at it in 2022. For instance, we're the 4th highest on record.
Thank you. My time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Chu.
Mr. Kogan, I want to address an accusation leveled against Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen